Okay, let's take these next two videos to examine the Cuban Revolution. And I want to spend two videos on it because the Cuban Revolution is the pivotal moment of 20th century Latin American history. Latin America is forever going to be changed as a result of the Cuban Revolution because what happens in Cuba is going to inspire people throughout the region to replicate what occurred on the island when the revolutionaries and Fidel Castro came to power in 1959. And this first video on the revolution, we'll just look at the insurrection when the rebels were fighting against the dictator during the 1950s. And then afterwards, when they come to power in 1959, we'll look at the reforms of the 1960s and particularly the confrontation with the United States. And just thinking about Cuba in a broader historical context, if you remember, before the midterm, we looked at the Spanish-American War, when the United States intervened in Cuba's War of Independence against Spain in 1898. And Cuba became independent in many respects from Spain, which was expelled from the island, but in the early part of the 20th century, the United States played a significant role and held a lot of power over the island. And this went on even through the good neighbor policy in the 1930s and the 1940s and 50s. The United States held a lot of power over Cuba and limited its independence and its ability to conduct its foreign policy as a sovereign nation. And the individual you see here on the slide is Fulgencio Batista. He was a very important politician in mid-20th century Cuba. He had actually started out as a populist leader in the 1930s. And he was president then in the early 1940s during World War II. So he was an important ally of the United States. And then he comes to power again in 1952. And he's going to rule the country until he's overthrown at the very beginning of 1959. And in the 50s, he ruled the country as a dictator. You know, that was kind of a running theme of a lot of these politicians like Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. They got their start as populists, but eventually would hold on to power and become dictators. So Batista rules the country in the 1950s as a dictator. And during the 50s, his rule was characterized by massive fraud and lots of corruption. And this was a period when American tourists came down to Havana quite a bit, and there was a lot of organized crime throughout Havana. Havana was like the first Las Vegas, and there was a lot of gangsters as well, and criminal bosses, and there was drugs, and there was a lot of prostitution in Havana as well, and the Batista regime was very corrupt. And of course, this created a lot of resentment. And from the beginning, there was opposition to Batista. And that opposition came from an individual we'll talk about now who's very important in Latin American history, and that is Fidel Castro. Here's an image of the young Fidel Castro. And he was originally from the eastern part of Cuba, and he had actually been raised by a middle-class family. And he attended the University of Havana, where he got a law degree. And he had been running for a seat in the Congress in 1952 when Batista took power. But of course, the elections were canceled when Batista declared himself a dictator. So Fidel Castro, as a response, decided he would take up arms against the Batista dictatorship. And in 1953, along with his brother Raul Castro and about 150 others, these rebels, they attacked the Moncada barracks. It was this military barracks in central Cuba. And it was a spectacular failure. Most of the rebels were killed, and Fidel was captured, and he was sent to prison. And but Fidel, because he attacked the dictatorship early on, he became a hero for this, and he spent several years in jail. And they had a trial for him before he went to prison. And he famously said, as he was defending himself in court, that, quote, "Condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me," end quote. And he gave a very famous speech in that defense that was printed throughout Cuba and made him a hero to many average Cubans. And just a few years later, however, he was pardoned in 1955. And from there, he was exiled, and he went to Mexico, and he started raising money to lead another revolution against the Batista dictatorship. And in Mexico is where other Cuban exiles joined him as well, and they named their movement the M26 movement. And they called it the M26 because the M is for the Moncada barracks where they had originally attacked the Batista dictatorship, and 26 because that attack had occurred on July 26th of 1953. So he's in Mexico in 1955, and he's organizing another revolution. And there were about 80 exiles in Mexico who in late 1956, they get on a boat and they set sail towards eastern Cuba. And their plan is to start a revolution that will lead to a general uprising and the overthrow of Batista. And at first it was a spectacular failure. The boat landed in eastern Cuba, and immediately they were attacked by the Cuban army. And most of the 80 rebels were killed there at the beaches, but about 20 survived. And those 20 were able to regroup, and they made their way to the nearby mountains, which were the Sierra Maestra. And from there is where they would lead the Cuban insurrection. And this is the stuff of Latin American lore, and this is the stuff that would really inspire other guerrilla movements throughout Latin America. And the rebels, there was only about 20 of them, and you see them pictured here. And they would grow beards, by the way, and this kind of became very symbolic of rebels throughout Latin America. They were known as Los Bárbaros, the bearded ones. And they recruited among the peasantry because the peasants were treated badly by the army. The army abused them. And by contrast, the rebels would treat the peasants quite well. So the peasants would feed them, give them intelligence about where the troops were in the mountains, and they were conducting guerrilla warfare. So guerrilla warfare is when you have a smaller force against a much more superior army. So they would do things like hit and run tactics, sabotage, assassinations, and the army was never able to decisively defeat the rebels throughout 1957 and 1958. Meanwhile, and this part of the story doesn't get told as much because there was also an insurrection going on in the cities. And this as well kind of consisted of urban guerrilla warfare. And actually, during 1957 and 58, most of the violence was in fact in the cities. There was a revolutionary group called the Revolutionary Directorate, and they would attack power plants, assassinate police and politicians, and they were really a pain in the side for the Batista government. But one of their leaders, they tried to attack Batista in the National Palace in Havana, and it was a failure, and many of these urban rebels were defeated, and their leader was killed as well. And that kind of hurt the urban movement, and that was when Fidel Castro in the mountains started to gain more popularity. And Fidel, they had a radio that they broadcast their message to throughout Cuba, and Fidel Castro also invited a New York Times reporter, Herbert Matthews, to report and get his message out about what was going on. And at this time, in fact, the American public was quite sympathetic with the rebels because they weren't communist. Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother, was a Marxist, but Fidel himself had not subscribed to the philosophy of communism. He was above all a nationalist, and they wanted to implement policies such as import substitution, industrialization, which were popular throughout Latin America during these years. And so the American public sympathized with the rebels because they were fighting for a more democratic country to overthrow the dictatorship. And Batista was brutal against the rebels, and his brutality really turned off the American public and also many Washington policymakers in the United States. The CIA was conducting research about Fidel Castro, and they concluded, in fact, that he was not a member of the Communist Party during these years. And so they kind of thought he was a hothead and were worried about if they could control him. But in the end, the United States would abandon Batista because of how brutal he was, and they stopped delivering military aid to Batista. And that was particularly when the rebels in late 1958 started to gain steam. And eventually the rebels come down to the Sierra Maestra as they gain more power and more followers, and they're able to confront the army in larger battles now. And Batista is going to resign, and he's going to flee Cuba in late 1958, and the rebels are going to come to power on January 1st, 1959. That's when the rebels enter Havana, and that's what we'll turn to now in the next video. And this, early 1959 was like a great moment of euphoria in Cuba because the dictator had been overthrown, and there was the promise of democracy and a more equal society in the years to come.